They told you it was just a kids' network. They told you it was just a movie. They told you the island was just a conspiracy theory. They were wrong on all three.
I was surrounded by them when I was 14 years old. Surrounded. Literally. Didn't even know it.
That man made the highest grossing independent film about child in Hollywood history. And before he made it, before any of us understood what he was really saying, he had already lived inside the machine he was exposing.
He was the guy who told me about Epstein's island more than a decade ago, and I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of.
A decade early. A decade before the arrests, the files, the flight logs, someone was already screaming. And the people who heard it laughed.
I'm in the files for not going, because Jeffrey Epstein was trying to meet with me.
One network, one island, one children's cartoon whose address drops a pin on Jeffrey Epstein's private property, and two men, one blacklisted, one nearly recruited, who have been pointing at the same machine for 30 years. But here's what nobody's connecting. Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel didn't just make a movie about child trafficking. They handed us a decoder ring, and when you hold it up to what was happening inside the most powerful children's network in television history, the picture that comes into focus will make your blood run cold. Let's start with a question that sounds simple but isn't. Why would two of the most powerful, most accomplished men in Hollywood risk everything, their careers, their reputations, their entire professional legacies, to make a movie about child sex? Not a prestige drama, not a carefully sanitized awards season picture with studio backing and red carpets. A raw, independently financed film that every major Hollywood institution actively worked to suppress, mock, and bury. Think about that for a second. Because in an industry where silence is currency and compliance is rewarded, Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel chose the opposite. They chose exposure. They chose confrontation. And they paid for it exactly the way every person who has ever gotten too close to this particular truth has paid for it, publicly, painfully, and without apology. To understand why Sound of Freedom hit the way it did, why it grossed over $250 million on a $14.5 million budget with zero studio support, active media mockery, and a coordinated campaign to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory film, you have to understand what these two men already knew before the cameras ever rolled. Jim Caviezel, the actor who played the lead role of Tim Ballard, a federal agent who goes rogue to rescue trapped children, had been talking about the realities of child networks for years before the film released. Not in vague terms, not in hypotheticals, in precise, documented structural terms that described operational logistics that sounded less like a script and more like a briefing document. And Mel Gibson, the producer, the man whose name and reputation and resources made the film possible, had been living with the knowledge of what Hollywood really was since he arrived there as a young man in his 20s.
A whole bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on, because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand.
Right.
And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me.
Nobody explained it to him, because that's how the machine works. You don't get a memo, you don't get a briefing, you get a feeling, a slow, creeping wrongness that the environment is trying very hard to convince you is just your imagination.
And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track with a lot of this stuff.
Exactly on track. Not paranoid, not unstable, not a conspiracy theorist. Correct. And here's the detail that reframes everything else in the story. Because the same industry that dismissed Gibson as unhinged, that blacklisted him, that turned his personal struggles into a public spectacle designed to obliterate his credibility, that same industry was simultaneously running a machine that was doing to children what Epstein was doing to the most powerful adults on the planet. Different targets, identical architecture, and the address that ties them together isn't metaphorical. It's 124 Conch Street, Bikini Bottom, SpongeBob SquarePants, the most iconic show in Nickelodeon history, watched by tens of millions of children around the world, week after week for over 2 decades. And if you type that fictional address into Google right now, go ahead and try it. It drops a pin directly on Little St. James Island, Jeffrey Epstein's island.
This is so messed up. I don't know what to think.
Now, is that a coincidence? Google's geocoding of fictional addresses is imprecise. Bikini Bottom was creatively inspired by Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. There's a rational explanation available if you want to reach for it. But here's the thing about rational explanations. They don't account for everything else. And once you lay everything else on the table, the convicted predators, the systematic isolation of children, the institutional silence, the paid exits, the suppressed films, the blacklisted directors, the address stops feeling like a glitch in Google Maps and starts feeling like a symbol of something much larger and much darker. A symbol that Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel were pointing at long before the Epstein files cracked open and forced the rest of the world to look. Here's what you need to understand about how Nickelodeon actually operated during its most powerful era. It was not a television network. A television network makes content, it hires crews, produces shows, sells advertising, and competes for ratings. That's what it looks like from the outside. That's the surface. Underneath the surface, Nickelodeon Nickelodeon during the Dan Schneider era was something structurally different. It was a pipeline, a carefully constructed, enormously profitable pipeline that ingested vulnerable children on one end and extracted their talent, their image, their youth, and in too many documented cases, far more than that on the other. And the intake process was deliberate. Children who want to be stars, children who are hungry for it, children whose ambition makes them vulnerable in a way that a predatory institution can identify and exploit with terrifying precision. Step 1, find them. Step 2, separate them from anyone who might protect them. Step 3, create dependency so profound that the child needs the machine more than the machine needs the child. Now stop and hold that framework in your mind, because that is not just the Nickelodeon playbook. That is the Epstein playbook.
Nerd fishing. He was fishing for nerds, and I think he caught a lot of nerds in that.
Epstein fished for scientists, for politicians, for royalty. He used young women as bait and the promise of elite intellectual community as the hook. The same structural logic: attract, isolate, compromise, own, applied at the highest levels of global power. Nickelodeon applied it to children, and the documented evidence of what that produced is not a collection of rumors or blind items. It is a court record. Brian Peck, a dialogue coach on The Amanda Show, convicted of assaulting Drake Bell. Drake described waking up mid-assault. He had to make a recorded phone call to extract a confession before Peck was arrested. Peck was convicted, sentenced to 16 months, and this is the detail that should end any remaining charitable interpretation of these institutions, he was hired by Disney. Jason Handy, Martin Weiss, 3 convicted predators, 1 network, 1 era, 1 man running the whole show, and laughing publicly about the power he had over those children. Now, here's the connection that Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel made, the connection that Sound of Freedom made that nobody in the mainstream conversation has been willing to follow to its logical conclusion. The trafficking network depicted in Sound of Freedom doesn't survive because it's hidden. It survives because it has legitimacy embedded around it like armor. Fake talent scouts, modeling agencies, promises of stardom, the appearance of opportunity that lowers a family's defenses just long enough for the trap to close.
You invite people to this immense, lavish celebration that with intellectual world leaders, geniuses. And you think, well, how could it be bad if all these geniuses are there?
Yeah.
And then next thing you know...
That's Epstein's genius, if you can call it that, applied in one direction. Legitimacy as a weapon. The more respected the names associated with the operation, the more impossible it becomes for any rational person to believe something criminal is occurring underneath. Now, apply that logic to Nickelodeon. For 20 years, the most beloved children's characters in the world lived inside that network. SpongeBob, iCarly, Drake and Josh, Victorious, Zoe 101. If those shows were there, if those characters were there, it must be safe. It must be approved. It must be fine. That cultural trust was the Nickelodeon endorsement. It was the exact same function that Bill Clinton's presence served on Epstein's island.
Since we're here, so it must be a secure area.
Exactly.
I can get
we
down.
are on the island with Bill.
Yeah.
This is fine.
We are watching SpongeBob. This is fine. We are sending our children to audition for this network. This is fine. The brand was the cover. The beloved characters were the cover. And behind that cover, convicted predators walked freely on set year after year, as if the institution itself was a magnet for them. But here is what Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel understood that the rest of Hollywood refused to acknowledge. You cannot build a machine like this without infrastructure, without logistics, without people in rooms making deliberate decisions to keep the intake flowing and the exit sealed. Sound of Freedom isn't a film about one bad man doing bad things. It's a film about a system, about the bureaucratic, financial, and social architecture that makes systemic exploitation not just possible, but sustainable across decades. And that architecture in the Epstein world, in the networks Gibson and Caviezel depicted, and inside Nickelodeon looked identical in every structural detail that matters. Now let's add the layer that makes this whole story collapse into focus. Because while Mel Gibson was living inside Hollywood's machine as a young actor feeling its wrongness before he could name it, Stanley Kubrick was spending years crafting a film that would name it for him, Eyes Wide Shut, released in 1999, the same year SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon.
Bill, I don't think you realize what kind of trouble you were in last night. Who do you think those people were? Those were not just ordinary people there. If I told you their names, I'm not going to tell you their names, but if I did, I don't think you'd sleep so well.
That is not a movie line. That is a blueprint. And Kubrick knew it was a blueprint, which is why the film was tampered with. Approximately 24 minutes of footage removed. A third-person narration stripped entirely. The pacing altered, the notes changed. And 6 days after delivering his final cut to Warner Brothers, 6 days, Stanley Kubrick was dead. Now, here's what that timeline means when you place it next to what was happening inside Nickelodeon at exactly the same moment. Kubrick delivers Eyes Wide Shut and dies within a week. The film that depicted elite abuse networks with documentary documentary-level precision is immediately cut and altered before the public sees it. That same year, SpongeBob premieres, and Nickelodeon is at the absolute peak of its power, its reach, and its cultural dominance. Dan Schneider is untouchable. The convicted predators haven't been caught yet. The machine is running perfectly. Two parallel realities, 1 week apart, both involving the same subject matter from completely opposite ends of the spectrum. One man tried to show the world what was happening in the rooms where powerful people gathered, and the other institution was quietly doing it to children in a building that had a laugh track.
What is the one piece of material I would actually rather know at this point than the contents of the Epstein files is the 25 minutes that were cut from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
What was in those 24 minutes? That question matters more now than it ever has. Because based on what we know from the Epstein files, the operational details, the names, the flight logs, the documented relationships, Kubrick's level of precision in depicting elite abuse networks suggests he wasn't working from imagination. He was working from knowledge. The same knowledge that Mel Gibson acquired over years of existing inside Hollywood's social infrastructure. The same knowledge that Jim Caviezel eventually turned into the most financially successful independent film in recent history. The same knowledge that Joe Rogan brushed up against the night he attended what he himself described as an eyes wide shut party.
He took me some eyes wide shut party in the middle of the Hollywood Hills. You had to get in an elevator and go to the top of this hill. What? Yeah, it was Naomi Campbell had this birthday party.
Naomi Campbell, a name that appears consistently in the Epstein files. A woman whose birthday party Joe Rogan attended and left, feeling like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. And his brain's immediate reference point, unprompted, unrehearsed, was Stanley Kubrick's suppressed film. That's not coincidence. That's pattern recognition operating at an unconscious level because the pattern is real. And then, because this story never runs out of layers, Jeffrey Epstein's team reached out to Joe Rogan directly in 2017. They tried to arrange a meeting. They tried to get him into the circle.
Files for not going, because Jeffrey Epstein was trying to meet with me.
Oh, I did see that.
Yeah, and I was like, what?
I'm like, no thanks.
Yeah.
Aren't you glad?
Yeah, but I would have never went anyway. It's like, it's not even a possibility that I would have went,
but
especially after I Googled them.
He said no, immediately, without hesitation, because something about it felt completely wrong. The same instinct that Mel Gibson had when he walked into Hollywood as a young man and felt the wrongness before he could name it. And what they were seeing, what they kept pointing at from different angles across different decades, was the same machine. Let's talk about the survivors, because this story doesn't belong to the directors or the podcasters or the theorists. It belongs to them. Angelique Bates, 12 years old when the abuse began on Nickelodeon sets. CPS was called. And then the very people whose institutional purpose was to protect her told her to stay quiet because the machine needed to keep running, because the ratings were good, because the money was flowing.
I was pressured by all the adults that were set to protect me to stay silent. I did, and I have. But I can no longer stay silent.
That voice, that specific sentence, that is the cost of the machine described in one breath. Drake Bell, Jeanette McCurdy, who wrote an entire memoir about the trauma she carried out of that network. Ariana Grande, who has spoken publicly about her discomfort on set. These are not isolated stories. In the film, the trafficking network survives not because the perpetrators are invisible. It survives because the people who know are either complicit, afraid, or operating within systems that are too compromised to act. The FBI knew about Epstein. The SDNY knew. There were investigations opened and quietly closed. There were deals made, plea agreements so light that the prosecutor who arranged them eventually had to resign in disgrace.
You guys have had this stuff for a year. Like,
we were promised multiple times, it's coming, it's coming.
Doesn't it seem like you could just throw all that into AI at this stage of the game?
Yes.
And just redact the names of the victims and let's go?
The Justice Department missed its own legal deadline by 40 days, released documents in carefully calibrated waves, then announced before the public had finished processing that the review was over. No new charges. Case closed. Move along. Nickelodeon quietly parted ways with Dan Schneider in March 2018, paying him the full $7 million still owed on his contract at the exact peak of the Me Too movement. Not fired, not investigated, paid out, and protected. Both cover-ups use the same architecture. Powerful institutions protecting powerful people by managing the release of damaging information until public outrage burned itself out. And in both cases, in the Epstein world and in the Nickelodeon machine, the survivors carried the cost while the institutions survived intact.
So it's not good that this thing was going on, that they had this bizarre blackmail operation running. That's very weird. But
Very weird is the understatement of the century, because what we're looking at across Epstein's network, across Nickelodeon's documented history, across the films that two of Hollywood's most blacklisted men made to warn us, is not a collection of isolated incidents of bad behavior, that he was causing harm by telling the truth. The same energy that paid Dan Schneider $7 million to disappear quietly, while the children he'd overseen carried their trauma in silence. The pattern is always identical. Silence the messenger, protect the network, move along. And then the DOJ released over 3 million pages, approximately 2,000 videos, roughly 180,000 images, flight logs, internal emails, sworn testimonies, contact lists, the most powerful names in the world, circling the same operation for years. Epstein's organization, who spent years being attacked by the same mainstream media that protected these people, suddenly wasn't a podcaster making observations from the outside. He was a character in the story.
he wants to say he was working for the Mossad. He very well could have been. He could have been working for the CIA. He could have been a guy who was on his own, but also working with them, right? Like a guy that they used, but they never fully endorsed.
Like an asset.
Yeah.
An asset, a professional fixer operating in what Rogan calls the sticky layer between government and private power. And Mel Gibson, the man they blacklisted, the man whose personal struggles became industry ammunition, the man who felt the wrongness of Hollywood before he could name it and spent decades being punished for naming it, came back. And the first major thing he did with that comeback was produce Sound of Freedom.
And then you go away and you think, no, I was wrong. I mean, that's insane thinking. I'm paranoid. I imagined that stuff. That couldn't be the reason for why so-and-so was acting like. Could it? And then you find out later on the track that...
Exactly on track. Jim Caviezel, in interviews promoting Sound of Freedom, described the scope of child trafficking networks in terms that match detail for detail the operational structure of what the Epstein files eventually confirmed. That made Joe Rogan say no to a meeting with Jeffrey Epstein without even needing a reason beyond his gut. They all felt the same thing. They all pointed at the same machine, and the machine dressed in a different costume every time, hiding behind a different beloved brand every decade, kept running, until enough people stopped keeping their eyes wide shut to the center of the earth. And somewhere in that darkness between a convicted financier's private island, a children's television network that made billions while convicted predators walked freely on its sets, a suppressed film whose director died 6 days after finishing it, and a $250 million independent movie that an entire industry tried to kill. There is a thread that hasn't been fully pulled yet. Kubrick drew the map. Gibson followed it 24 years later. Caviezel put it on screen. And somewhere in Bikini Bottom, a cartoon character's address points to an island that real children never should have been anywhere near. Drop a comment. Tell us which connection hit you hardest. And if you think these stories deserve to be told, share this video. Because the people who built these machines built them to last, and they built them to stay in the dark. The least we can do is keep the light on.